She passed out by the frozen river with nothing but torn stockings and a prayer. Then a silent Lakota wrapped her in his blanket, carried her to safety, and changed the course of 2 broken lives forever. The winter of 1876 had settled over the Dakota Territory like a curse from an angry god, turning the normally rushing waters of Clearwater Creek into a sheet of ice so thick that freight wagons could cross without fear of breaking through. But on this particular February morning, as dawn struggled to pierce the gray clouds heavy with the promise of more snow, the ice held secrets beneath its frozen surface, secrets that gurgled and whispered as the current tried desperately to flow beneath nature's crystalline prism. Celeste Harper stumbled through the knee-deep snow that blanketed the riverbank, her worn leather boots offering little protection against the bitter cold that seemed to seep through her very bones.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Her burgundy dress, once elegant enough for Philadelphia drawing rooms, now hung in tatters around her ankles, the hem blackened with mud and ice, the sleeves torn from catching on thorny undergrowth during her 3-day flight through the wilderness. Each breath came out in desperate puffs of white vapor, her lungs burning from the frigid air and the exhaustion that threatened to drag her down into the snow where she would surely freeze before the sun reached its peak. Behind her, somewhere, in the maze of pine and birch that stretched endlessly across the territory, the sound of pursuit had finally faded. The horses, the dogs, the angry voices calling for justice, all had been swallowed by the vast silence of the winter wilderness. But Celeste knew they would find her trail again once the storm passed. They always did. Men like Colonel Bradford Hutchinson had resources, connections, and the kind of righteous fury that never tired of hunting down those who had dared to cross. Them, she had been running for 6 days now, ever since that terrible night in Fort Laramie, when everything she thought she knew about honor and duty had shattered like thin ice under a horse's hoof. The memory still burned in her mind, the way Colonel Hutchinson's eyes had turned cold as winter steel when she refused his advances, the casual cruelty with which he had destroyed her reputation with a few carefully chosen lies, the satisfied smirk on his face as the military tribunal declared her guilty of treason based on evidence she knew he had fabricated. The charges were absurd, of course. Celeste Harper, daughter of a respected Boston merchant, granddaughter of a revolutionary war hero, accused of selling military secrets to hostile Indian tribes. But in a frontier fort where the colonel's word was law and due process was a luxury few could afford, absurd charges could still result in a hangman's noose, especially when the accused was a woman who had made the mistake of rejecting the wrong man's attentions. So she had run, stolen a horse in the dead of night, ridden hard across frozen ground until the animal collapsed from exhaustion, then continued on foot through country that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to challenge its harsh embrace. She had survived on handfuls of snow for water and the few strips of jerky she had managed to grab from the fort's kitchen during her escape. But now, after days of stumbling through wilderness that stretched in every direction like a white ocean, she was reaching the end of her strength. The frozen river stretched before her like a highway to nowhere, its surface gleaming with a treacherous beauty that promised either salvation or death. On the far side, she could see smoke rising from what might be a trapper's cabin or an Indian camp. Either option carried its own dangers. Trappers in this territory were often outlaws themselves, men who had fled civilization for reasons that decent folks didn't ask about, while the presence of Indians meant potential violence that her exhausted mind could barely comprehend. But the alternative was to keep stumbling through snow that grew deeper with each step, following a river that might lead nowhere until the cold finally claimed her as it had claimed so many other souls foolish enough to challenge the Dakota winter. Celeste had not survived 6 days in the wilderness only to surrender now. If she was going to die, it would be while moving forward, Not while cowering in the snow like a frightened rabbit. She took her first tentative step onto the ice, testing its strength with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that a single mistake could mean death. The surface held firm beneath her weight, though she could hear the river murmuring its protests from somewhere far below. Step by careful step, she made her way toward the center of the frozen waterway, her arms outstretched for balance, her eyes fixed on the distant shore where smoke continued to rise in lazy spirals against the gray sky. It was when she reached the middle of the crossing that her strength finally failed her. The exhaustion she had been fighting for days crashed over her like an avalanche, her vision blurring as her blood sugar plummeted and her body finally rebelled against the impossible demands she had placed upon it. The ice seemed to tilt beneath her feet, the world spinning as darkness crept in from the edges of her consciousness. Celeste felt herself falling, her knees striking the frozen surface with a crack that echoed across the empty landscape. She tried to push herself back up, but her arms had turned to lead, her muscles refusing to obey the desperate commands of her mind. The cold began seeping through her dress where it pressed against the ice, stealing what little warmth remained. In her body, this is how it ends, she thought with a strange sense of peace. Not at the end of a rope in Fort Laramie, not torn apart by wolves in the wilderness, but simply lying down on a frozen river like some fairy tale princess waiting for a prince who would never come. There were worse ways to die, she supposed. At least here, in this vast emptiness, there was a kind of dignity in surrendering to forces larger than herself. But as consciousness began to slip away like water through her fingers, Celeste became aware of something that didn't belong to the winter silence. Footsteps, soft and careful, approaching across the ice with the measured gait of someone who understood how to move without creating unnecessary sound. Her heart hammered with sudden terror. Had they found her after all? Was Colonel Hutchinson's reach so long that his men could track her even into this frozen wasteland? Through her dimming vision, she saw a figure approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. But as the figure drew closer, she realized this was not one of Hutchinson's soldiers. The man wore buckskins decorated with intricate beadwork, his long black hair braided with strips of leather and small bones that clicked softly as he moved. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked with the kind of lines that spoke of years spent reading the subtle languages of weather and wildlife. A Lakota warrior, Celeste realized with a mixture of fear and strange relief. She had heard countless stories about the savage Indians who supposedly roamed these territories, murdering innocent settlers and stealing children in the night. But looking up at this man as he knelt beside her on the ice, she saw none of the bloodthirsty cruelty that frontier newspapers loved to describe. Instead, his dark eyes held a depth of understanding that reminded her of her grandfather's gaze, the look of someone who had seen much suffering and chose compassion over indifference. Without speaking, the Lakota man reached into a leather pack slung across his shoulder and withdrew a blanket, woven from buffalo hide and decorated with geometric patterns in red and blue. The blanket radiated warmth as he wrapped it around her shivering form, the buffalo fur soft against her frozen skin. She tried to speak, to thank him or at least ask his name, but her voice emerged as nothing more than a weak whisper that was lost in the wind. The warrior slipped his arms beneath her knees and shoulders, lifting her from the ice with surprising gentleness. Celeste had expected roughness, the casual handling she had received from soldiers and bounty hunters, but this man carried her as if she were made of spun glass, his movements careful and deliberate as he navigated the treacherous surface of the frozen river. As they reached the far shore, Celeste managed to focus her eyes enough to study her rescuer's face. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30 years old, with high cheekbones and skin the color of burnished copper. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, speaking of some long-ago violence, but his expression remained.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. back to the story.
Serene as he carried her through the snow toward a stand of pine trees, where she could now see the source of the smoke she had spotted from across the river. Hidden among the trees was a shelter unlike anything she had seen before. Not quite a cabin, not quite a tent, but something that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. The structure was built from pine logs and animal hides, designed to blend so seamlessly with its surroundings that it would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Smoke rose from a carefully concealed fire pit, and she could smell the rich aroma of roasting meat that made her empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. The Lakota man pushed through a flap of buffalo hide that served as a door, carrying her into a space that was surprisingly warm and comfortable. The floor was covered with layers of soft furs, while the walls were lined with weapons, tools, and supplies that spoke of someone who had learned to live entirely off the land. A small fire crackled in a stone-lined pit, its smoke drawn upward through a clever arrangement of hide flaps that prevented the light from being seen from outside. He laid her gently on a bed of wolf pelts near the fire, then began moving around the shelter with economical efficiency. From various containers and pouches, he assembled what appeared to be some kind of medicinal tea, crushing dried herbs between his palms and adding them to a clay pot of simmering water. The resulting brew filled the air with a scent that was both bitter and oddly comforting, like medicine that promised healing even as it warned of unpleasant taste. When the tea was ready, he knelt beside her and carefully lifted her head, bringing the clay cup to her lips. The liquid was indeed bitter, but it spread warmth through her chest and belly in a way that plain water never could. After she had drunk half the cup, he set it aside and began examining her feet, gently removing her ruined boots and stockings to reveal toes that were white with frostbite. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he massaged her frozen feet, working to restore circulation without causing the kind of pain that would indicate serious tissue damage. Throughout this process, he maintained a silence that seemed natural rather than ominous, as if words were simply unnecessary for the work at hand. Celeste found herself studying his face in the firelight, noting the concentration with which he tended to her injuries and the careful respect he showed for her modesty, even as he worked to save her life. It was only when he began preparing what appeared to be a meal rabbit stew with wild onions and some kind of grain she didn't recognize that Celeste managed to find her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling rusty and unfamiliar after days of silence. "I don't know why you helped me, but thank you." The Lakota man looked up from his cooking, his dark eyes meeting hers across the small fire. For a moment, she thought he might not respond at all, that perhaps he didn't speak English or had chosen not to acknowledge her words. But then he nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance of her gratitude and dismissal of any need for. "Thanks, Kohana," he said finally, his voice low and slightly rough from disuse. The single word hung in the air between them like an offering. "Kohana," Celeste repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables on her tongue. "Is that your name?" Another nod, followed by a gesture toward her that seemed to be asking for her. "Name in return, Celeste," she said. "Celeste Harper." Kohana repeated her name with the same careful attention she had given to his, then returned to his cooking. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the shelter. Some barrier had been crossed that made the space feel less like a temporary refuge, and more like a place where two people might actually coexist. As the rabbit stew simmered over, the fire filling the shelter with rich aromas that made Celeste's mouth water despite her exhaustion, she found herself studying this man who had saved her life. Everything about him spoke of competence and self-sufficiency. The way he moved around the small space without wasted motion, the quality of his weapons and tools, the obvious care with which he had constructed his hidden shelter. This was not some savage living in primitive squalor, as frontier newspapers loved to portray Indians, but a skilled craftsman who had chosen to live apart from both white and red societies. "Why do you live alone out here?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question as presumptuous. But Kohana didn't seem offended by her curiosity. Instead, he was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. "Sometimes," he said finally, stirring the stew with a carved wooden spoon, "a man must choose between the world he was born into and the world he can live with." The words carried a weight that spoke of personal experience, of choices made and prices paid. Celeste understood that weight better than most people. She had, after all, chosen to flee into the wilderness rather than submit to Colonel Hutchinson's version of justice. But she sensed that Kohana's exile was older than hers, rooted in conflicts and betrayals that stretched back years rather than days. When the stew was ready, he served it in carved wooden bowls, handing her one along with a spoon made from polished horn. The first taste was revelatory, rich, complex, seasoned with herbs that she couldn't identify but that seemed to warm her from the inside out. She ate slowly, savoring each bite while being careful not to overwhelm her empty stomach too quickly. "This is wonderful," she said between spoonfuls. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" A ghost of a smile crossed Kohana's features. "My grandmother. She said a man who cannot feed himself properly cannot feed his family properly." "Do you have a family?" The question slipped out before Celeste could stop it, and she saw something flicker across his expression. Pain, perhaps, or loss. "I did," he said simply, and the finality in his tone made it clear that this particular subject was not open for further discussion. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind moving through the pine trees outside. As the warmth of food and shelter began to restore Celeste's strength, she became increasingly aware of her situation. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she knew nothing about, completely dependent on his goodwill for her survival. By all the rules of frontier society, this should have terrified her. A white woman alone with an Indian man was supposed to fear for her virtue if not her life. But looking at Kohana as he carefully cleaned their bowls and banked the fire for the night, Celeste felt no fear at all. There was something fundamentally decent about this man, something that spoke to her instincts in a way that Colonel Hutchinson's polished manners and military bearing never had. She had learned to trust those instincts during her escape from Fort Laramie. They had kept her alive when logic and civilized thinking would have gotten her killed. "I should tell you," she said as Kohana arranged additional furs to make her sleeping area more comfortable. "There are men looking for me, soldiers. If they find me here, they'll assume you're helping me, and that could mean trouble for you." Kohana paused in his work, looking at her with those penetrating dark eyes. "What did you do?" "I refused to let a powerful man use me as he wished. So he accused me of treason." The words came out more bitter than she had intended, but she saw understanding flicker across Kohana's features. "And you ran rather than face their justice." "I ran rather than face their rope," Celeste corrected. "There's a difference." Kohana nodded slowly, then continued arranging the furs. "Men with power," he said quietly. "They always believe their desires are more important than other people's lives." Something in his tone suggested he spoke from personal experience, but Celeste didn't press for details. Instead, she watched as he prepared his own sleeping area on the opposite side of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance that spoke well of his character. "Tomorrow," he said as he settled down for the night, "we will see if your feet are strong enough for walking. If not, you will stay here until they heal. And if they are strong enough, then we will decide what comes next." It was not much of a plan, but it was more hope than Celeste had possessed when she collapsed on the frozen river. As she pulled the buffalo hide blanket up to her chin and listened to the fire settling into glowing coals, she found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a respectable woman in Fort Laramie, concerned with social calls and proper etiquette. Now she was lying in an Indian shelter, dependent on the kindness of a man whose language she barely spoke and whose culture she understood even less. But for the first time in days, she felt truly safe. Whatever else Kohana might be, he was not a man who would harm someone under his protection. And perhaps, in this hidden place between worlds, she might find time to heal more than just her frostbitten feet. Outside the shelter, the wind sang. Through the pine trees with a sound like distant voices, carrying stories of survival and loss across the endless Dakota winter. Inside, two people who had been cast out by their respective societies settled into an uneasy peace, neither knowing that their chance meeting by a frozen river would set in motion events that would challenge everything they thought they knew. About loyalty, love, and the price of choosing honor over safety. The morning sun painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink when Celeste awakened to the sound of Kohana moving quietly around the shelter. Her body ached from the ordeal of the previous day, but the desperate weakness that had nearly killed her on the frozen river had been replaced by something closer to normal fatigue. The medicinal tea and nourishing stew had worked their magic during the night, and she could feel strength slowly returning to her limbs. Kohana knelt by the fire pit, coaxing flames from the banked coals with practiced efficiency. He had already dressed in fresh buckskins, his hair newly braided with what appeared to be small silver ornaments that caught the firelight. When he noticed her stirring, he glanced over with those penetrating dark eyes, as she caught something that might have been relief in his expression. "How do your feet feel?" he asked, his voice carrying the same quiet authority she had noticed the night before. Celeste flexed her toes experimentally beneath the buffalo hide blanket. There was still some numbness in her smallest toes, and a tingling sensation that spoke of healing frostbite, but the sharp pain she had expected was notably absent. "Better than I feared they would," she admitted. Kohana nodded and reached for a leather pouch hanging from one of the shelter's support posts. From it, he withdrew what appeared to be a salve made from animal fat mixed with crushed herbs. The mixture gave off a sharp, medicinal scent that reminded Celeste of the hospital tents she had volunteered in during the war. "This will help." "The healing," he said, approaching her sleeping area with the same careful respect he had shown the night before. "But first you must eat. The body cannot repair itself without fuel." He had prepared what appeared to be a breakfast of short strips of dried meat that had been softened in broth, along with a porridge made from some kind of ground grain, mixed with berries that had been preserved in fat. The combination was unlike anything from Celeste's previous experience, but it was surprisingly satisfying, providing a steady energy that she could feel spreading through her body as she ate. Kohana busied himself with what appeared to be routine maintenance tasks around the shelter. He sharpened his knives with smooth, rhythmic strokes against a whetstone, checked the bindings on his snowshoes, and examined various traps and snares that hung from pegs along the walls. Everything he did was performed with an economy of motion that spoke of years spent living by himself in the wilderness. "How long have you lived like this?" Celeste asked, gesturing around the well-organized shelter. Kohana paused in his knife sharpening, considering her question with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "3 winters," he said finally. "Since the Troubles." At Standing Rock, the name meant nothing to Celeste, but she could hear the weight behind it, the kind of significance that came from events that changed everything. She waited, hoping he might elaborate, but Kohana had returned to his knife maintenance with renewed focus. "What happened at Standing Rock?" she asked gently. This time, the pause was longer, and when Kohana looked up, his expression had grown distant. "My people were promised land, food, protection if they moved to the reservation. The agent promised schools for our children, tools for farming, cattle to replace the buffalo herds." His voice carried a bitterness that spoke of promises broken and trust betrayed. "What they gave us was spoiled meat, thin blankets, and diseases that killed more of us than cavalry bullets ever had." Celeste felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Dakota winter. She had heard stories about the reservation system, but always from the perspective of government officials who spoke of bringing civilization to savage peoples. This was the first time she had heard the other side of that story. I was chosen to speak for our band when complaints arose. Kohana continued, his hand still working the whetstone along the blade's edge. I had learned English from missionary teachers, understood the white man's writing. I thought knowledge of their language would help me protect my people. What went wrong? Agent Morrison was stealing supplies meant for our families, selling them to settlers and keeping the profits. Children were starving while he grew fat on food that belonged to them. Kohana's jaw tightened at the memory. When I brought proof to the territorial authorities, they said an Indian's word meant nothing against a white man's reputation. Celeste felt her own anger rising at the casual injustice he described. It was the same dismissive arrogance she had encountered with Colonel Hutchinson, the belief that power made its own rules and consequences were for other people. So what did you do? I took the stolen supplies back. At night, quietly, returning them to the families who were meant to receive them. Kohana set down his knife and whetstone, meeting her eyes directly. But Agent Morrison discovered what I was doing. He claimed I was leading raids against white settlements, stealing cattle and horses. Sent cavalry to arrest me as a hostile. But you escaped. I escaped. But my family did not. The words came out flat and emotionless, but Celeste could see the pain behind them. My wife, my daughter, my younger brother, they died in the fighting when soldiers came to arrest me. Shot down like animals while trying to protect children who had nothing to do with any of it. The silence that followed was heavy with grief and rage that had been carefully controlled, but never resolved. Celeste found herself thinking of her own losses, her parents' deaths from influenza, the isolation she had felt as an unmarried woman trying to make her way in a world that offered few options for women of independent spirit. But her losses seemed small compared to what Kohana had endured. I'm sorry, she said quietly, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to offer something. Kohana acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod, then rose and moved to one of the shelter's walls where various items hung from wooden pegs. Among them was what appeared to be a child's toy, a small doll made from corn husks and decorated with tiny beads and feathers. His fingers touched it briefly, and Celeste realized she was looking at all that remained of his daughter. Her name was Ayana, he said without turning around. It means eternal blossom. She was 6 years old when she died, and she loved to make up songs about the animals she saw in the forest. The simple statement hit Celeste harder than any dramatic declaration might have. She could picture this fierce, competent man teaching a little girl to identify bird calls and track rabbit prints in the snow. Could imagine him listening patiently to childish songs about squirrels and deer. What was your wife's name? She asked, Wikapewin. It means star woman. She was the daughter of a medicine man, knew more about healing herbs than anyone in our band. Kohana turned back toward the fire, and Celeste could see him struggling to maintain his composure. She could have saved many lives if she had been allowed to live. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of shared grief creating an unexpected intimacy between them. Celeste found herself thinking about the arbitrary nature of loss, the way violence and injustice could destroy entire futures in a matter of moments. She had been fortunate. Her escape from Fort Laramie had cost her reputation and social standing, but not her life or the lives of people she loved. Is that why you helped me? She asked eventually. Because you recognize injustice when you see it. Kohana considered this question with his usual thoughtfulness. Partly, he admitted. But also because my grandmother taught me that when the spirits place someone in your path who needs help, refusing to help them brings misfortune to your own spirit. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She died of smallpox during my first winter on the reservation, along with most of the elders. The old knowledge died with them, stories, medicines, ceremonies that had been passed down for generations. His voice carried a sadness that went beyond personal loss to encompass the destruction of an entire way of life. Celeste found herself thinking about her own family's traditions, the recipes her mother had taught her, the business practices she had learned from her merchant father, the social skills that had been considered essential for a woman of her class. All of that seemed trivial compared to the systematic destruction of an entire culture, but she understood something about the pain of watching familiar worlds disappear. Is that why you live alone now? Because there's nothing left of the old ways? I live alone because I cannot go back to what remains of my people, and I cannot live among the whites who killed my family. Kohana began applying the medicinal salve to her feet with gentle, practiced movements. Here, in the spaces between worlds, I can at least live according to my own understanding of what is right. The salve was warming as he massaged it into her skin, and Celeste could feel circulation improving in her damaged toes. His touch was completely professional, but she found herself acutely aware of the intimacy of the situation. In her previous life, allowing any man who was not her husband to handle her feet would have been scandalous beyond description. Now it simply felt like necessary care from someone who understood healing. What about you? Kohana asked as he worked. What kind of life did you have before Colonel Hutchinson decided to destroy it? Celeste was surprised by the directness of the question, but she found herself wanting to answer honestly. I was what people called a spinster, she said with a slight smile. 28 years old and unmarried, living on the charity of distant relatives who considered me a burden. They were too Christian to abandon entirely. You never wanted to marry? I wanted to marry for love, not convenience. And I wanted to keep some control over my own life and decisions. She watched his face for signs of judgment, but saw only interest. That made me difficult in the eyes of most men. They wanted wives who would be grateful for their protection and never question their authority. Kohana finished with the salve and began wrapping her feet in soft strips of deerskin. And Colonel Hutchinson? He was different at first. Charming, respectful, seemingly interested in my opinions on books and politics. I thought he might be the kind of man who could accept an independent woman as a partner rather than demanding a submissive servant. Celeste's voice grew bitter at the memory. I was wrong. He was simply more patient in his approach to breaking me down. What changed? He proposed marriage, and I asked for time to consider. That should have been the end of it, a woman's right to think about such an important decision. But he took my hesitation as a personal insult. She could still remember the cold fury in Hutchinson's eyes when she had asked for a week to make up her mind. When I finally decided I couldn't marry a man I didn't love, he became vengeful. So he accused you of treason. He claimed I had been passing information about fort defenses to hostile Indians. Said he had seen me meeting secretly with Indian scouts, giving them maps and patrol schedules. Celeste laughed bitterly. The truth was, I had befriended some of the Crow women who did laundry at the fort. I was teaching a few of them to read English in exchange for learning some of their language. But in Hutchinson's version, those language lessons became treasonous conspiracies. Kohana secured the deerskin wrappings with thin leather strips, then sat back on his heels. And people believed him. They wanted to believe him. I was an unmarried woman with unconventional ideas about female independence. That made me suspect in many people's minds already. Adding accusations of treason just gave them permission to act on their existing prejudices. So you ran rather than face trial. I ran because the trial was a foregone conclusion. Hutchinson had witnesses prepared to testify they had seen me engaging in suspicious activities. He had forged documents that supposedly proved my guilt. The only thing I didn't understand was why he went to such elaborate lengths to destroy me. Kohana rose and moved back to the fire, stirring the coals thoughtfully. Some men cannot accept that there are things in the world they cannot possess or control. When such a man encounters someone who refuses to be owned, it drives him to extremes. The observation was uncomfortably accurate, and Celeste found herself wondering how Kohana had developed such insight into the psychology of powerful men. She suspected his understanding came from personal experience with the same kind of arbitrary cruelty she had suffered. "Do you think he'll keep hunting for me?" she asked. "Men like that don't give up easily. He has probably convinced himself that your escape makes him look weak, which means catching you has become about more than just revenge. It's about proving he cannot be defied." The thought was sobering, but not entirely unexpected. Celeste had known when she fled Fort Laramie that she was choosing a life of permanent exile. There could be no going back to the world she had known, no return to the social circles where her family name had once meant something. "What will you do?" Kohana asked. "When your feet are healed and you're strong enough to travel?" It was a question Celeste had been avoiding, partly because she had no good answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have a little money hidden in my dress, enough for supplies but not enough to start a new life anywhere civilized. And I have no skills that would allow me to support myself in frontier towns, where women's options are limited. You could go to California or Oregon, places where people don't ask too many questions about past lives, perhaps. But traveling alone as a woman would be almost as dangerous as staying here. And I have no contacts, no one who could help me establish a new identity." Kohana was quiet for several minutes, and Celeste could sense him working through some internal debate. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "You could stay here for the winter, until spring makes travel easier and your strength is fully restored." Celeste stared at him in amazement. "You would do that? Let a stranger share your shelter for months? You are not exactly a stranger anymore. And this place is large enough for two people, if both are willing to respect proper boundaries." The offer was incredibly generous, but also potentially scandalous in ways that could destroy both their reputations if word ever got out. A white woman living alone with an Indian man would be seen as evidence of either captivity or moral degradation. "People would assume the worst if they knew," she said carefully. "People assume the worst about me already. And there are no people here to make assumptions anyway." It was true they were completely isolated in this hidden shelter, far from the judgment of civilized society. And Celeste was beginning to realize that she trusted Kohana's character more than she had trusted any man in years. He had already shown her more genuine respect and kindness than Colonel Hutchinson had managed in months of courtship. "What would I do to earn my keep?" she asked. "I know nothing about wilderness survival. You could learn. I could teach you to prepare hides, preserve meat, gather medicinal plants. Knowledge that might prove useful wherever you eventually decide to go." The prospect was both terrifying and oddly exciting. Celeste had always been curious about practical skills that were considered inappropriate for women of her social class. Here was an opportunity to learn abilities that could make her truly independent. And in spring? In spring, you decide what kind of life you want to build, with knowledge and skills that will help you survive whatever you choose. Celeste looked around the warm, comfortable shelter that had become her refuge from the winter and the men who hunted her. She thought about the alternatives, stumbling through snow toward uncertain destinations, trying to survive in frontier towns where her past might catch up with her, attempting to build a new life with no resources and no allies. "Yes," she said finally. "I would like to stay and learn. If you're certain you can tolerate having me here." Kohana's rare smile appeared, transforming his usually serious expression. "I think we will manage well enough." And so began an unlikely partnership between two people who had been cast out by their respective societies, a white woman fleeing false accusations and a Lakota man mourning the destruction of everything he had once held dear. Neither of them could have predicted that winter in the hidden shelter would become the foundation for something deeper than mere survival, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about trust, healing, and the possibility of finding home in the most unexpected places. The blizzard that struck in the third week of February was unlike anything Celeste had experienced, even during her harsh childhood winters in Boston, for 6 days. The wind howled across the Dakota Territory with the fury of something alive and malevolent, driving snow so thick that stepping outside the shelter meant instant disorientation and probable death. Inside their hidden refuge, Celeste and Kohana waited out nature's assault with the patient endurance of those who understood that some forces could only be survived, never conquered. It was during this enforced confinement that their partnership truly began to take shape. Kohana taught Celeste the intricate art of preparing hides, showing her how to scrape away every trace of flesh and fat without damaging the skin beneath, how to work the brain-tanned leather until it became soft as silk, how to waterproof it with a mixture of pine pitch and rendered animal fat. Her hands, soft from her previous life of leisure, grew calloused and strong as she learned to use the traditional tools with increasing skill. "The buffalo gave us everything," Kohana explained as they worked on a particularly large hide that would become a winter coat. Meat for food, bones for tools, sinew for thread, hide for shelter and clothing. "My grandmother said the buffalo were our brothers, and we must honor their sacrifice by using every part with respect and gratitude." Celeste found herself fascinated by this philosophy of reciprocity with the natural world, so different from the conquest mentality she had grown up with. In her former life, nature was something to be tamed and exploited, resources to be harvested for human benefit without thought of consequence or sustainability. But Kohana's approach revealed a different way of thinking about humanity's relationship with the earth, one based on partnership rather than domination. "What happened to the buffalo herds?" she asked, working carefully to remove a stubborn piece of membrane from the hide. Kohana's expression darkened. "The railroad companies paid hunters to kill them by the thousands, not for meat or hides, but to starve the Indian tribes into submission. They left the bodies to rot on the plains, taking only the tongues and leaving the rest for vultures." The casual waste of such magnificent creatures appalled Celeste, but she was beginning to understand that the destruction of the buffalo was part of a larger strategy to destroy the Indian way of life entirely. Without the herds, the tribes had no choice but to accept reservation life or face starvation. As the days passed, Celeste discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the traditional crafts Kohana taught her. Her nimble fingers, trained by years of fine needlework and delicate household tasks, adapted quickly to working with sinew and beads, leather and bone. She learned to fashion arrows with perfectly balanced shafts, to weave baskets so tightly they could hold water, to prepare medicines from roots and barks that Kohana gathered during brief forays outside the shelter. But it was when he began teaching her to hunt that Celeste truly surprised herself. She had never held a weapon more dangerous than a butter knife, had been raised to believe that violence was the province of men, and that feminine delicacy required protection from such harsh realities. Yet when Kohana placed a bow in her hands and showed her how to draw the string, how to sight along the arrow shaft, how to release with smooth consistency, something clicked into place. "You have good instincts," he said after she managed to hit a mark he had carved into a tree at 30 paces. "Your eye sees the target clearly, and your hands do not tremble when the moment comes to release." The compliment meant more to Celeste than any praise she had received for her skill at watercolor painting or piano performance. This was practical knowledge, the kind of ability that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. For the first time in her adult life, she was learning skills that made her truly independent rather than merely ornamental. It was on the 7th day after the blizzard ended that their peaceful routine was shattered by the distant sound of horses moving through snow. Kohana heard them first, his head lifting from the rabbit snare he was repairing, his entire body going still with the alertness of a deer sensing predators. Within seconds, he had crossed to the shelter's entrance and was peering carefully through a gap in the hide covering. "Riders," he said quietly. 6 men, possibly more. Moving in formation like soldiers, Celeste felt her blood turn to ice water. She moved to join him at the entrance, and through the narrow opening she could see dark figures on horseback, picking their way carefully through the snow-laden forest. Even at this distance, she could recognize the blue uniforms and military. Bearing that meant only one thing. "Hutchinson found me," she whispered. Kohana pulled her back from the entrance, his expression grim but determined. "Not necessarily. Military patrols sometimes pass through this area during winter months, checking for hostile Indian activity. They may not be looking for you specifically, but even as he spoke, they could hear voices calling through the trees, and one of them carried the unmistakable authority of command. Spread out. Check every clearing, every shelter, every place. Someone might hide. She's here somewhere, and I want her found before nightfall." Colonel Bradford Hutchinson had indeed found her trail, and he had brought enough men to ensure that this time there would be no escape. Celeste felt the familiar panic rising in her chest, the same desperate fear that had driven her from Fort Laramie into the winter wilderness. But now there was more at stake than just her own life. If Hutchinson's men found her here, they would certainly kill Kohana as well, probably after torturing him for information about other hostile Indians in the area. "I have to leave," she said, already moving toward the back of the shelter where her few possessions were kept. "If they find me here, they'll kill you too." Kohana caught her arm gently but firmly. "Where will you go? The snow is still deep, the cold still deadly. You would not survive one night alone in the wilderness. Then what do you suggest? That I wait here for them to find me and hang both of us?" Instead of answering directly, Kohana moved to a section of the shelter's back wall that Celeste had never paid much attention to. He pressed against what appeared to be a solid panel of hides, and to her amazement, it swung inward to reveal a narrow tunnel leading back into the hillside. The passage was barely wide enough for one person to crawl through, and it disappeared into darkness beyond the range of firelight. "Emergency exit," he explained quietly. "Every good shelter needs a way out that enemies cannot see. This tunnel leads to a cave system about half a mile from here. You can hide there while I deal with the soldiers." "What do you mean, deal with them?" "I mean convince them that no one has been here recently. That this shelter is abandoned, just another empty Indian camp left behind when my people were forced onto reservations." Celeste stared at him in horror. "They'll kill you if they suspect you're lying. Hutchinson isn't the kind of man who asks polite questions. Then I will have to be very convincing." The voices outside were getting closer, and they could hear boots crunching through snow as the soldiers began their systematic search of the area. There was no more time for argument or planning. Kohana quickly gathered essential supplies, blankets, food, water, and a rifle he kept hidden beneath his sleeping furs. "Take these," he said, pressing the bundle into her arms. "Follow the tunnel until you reach the main cave. There is a chamber about 50 feet from the entrance where you will be safe, even if they bring tracking dogs. Wait there until I come for you. And if you don't come?" Kohana's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she saw past his warriors. Stoicism to the man beneath. "Then you will know I died trying to protect you, and you will use what I have taught you to survive until spring brings better options." Before Celeste could protest further, he kissed her forehead gently, a gesture so unexpected and tender that it left her speechless. Then he was pushing her toward the hidden tunnel, his hands firm but careful as he helped her into the narrow opening. "Go," he whispered urgently. "And remember, whatever happens, you are stronger than you know." Celeste crawled into the darkness, dragging the supply bundle behind her, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the soldiers would hear it from outside. The tunnel was claustrophobic and frightening, barely tall enough for her to move through on hands and knees, but she forced herself to keep going. Behind her, she could hear Kohana moving around the shelter, presumably erasing any evidence of her presence. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, winding through rock and frozen earth in a path that Kohana must have dug by hand over many months. Celeste tried not to think about the tons of stone and dirt above her head, or the possibility that she might become lost in underground passages that no one else knew existed. She focused instead on the sound of her own breathing and the need to put as much distance as possible between herself and the soldiers who hunted her. When she finally emerged into the cave system Kohana had described, Celeste found herself in a space larger than she had expected. The main chamber was perhaps 20 feet across and tall enough for her to stand upright, with several smaller passages leading deeper into the hillside. Pale light filtered down from somewhere above, suggesting that there were other openings. To the surface that provided both air and illumination, she made her way to the chamber Kohana had mentioned, a cozy alcove that was completely hidden from the main entrance. Here she arranged the supplies he had given her and settled down to wait, straining her ears for any sound that might indicate what was happening back at the shelter. The silence was almost worse than noise would have been. Celeste found herself imagining all the terrible things that might be occurring. Kohana being tortured for information, being shot while trying to convince the soldiers of his innocence, being dragged away in chains to face the same kind of military justice that had destroyed so many other innocent people. She had known this man for less than a month, but the thought of him suffering because of her filled her with a grief that surprised her with its intensity. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Celeste tried to distract herself by inventorying the supplies Kohana had given her, by exploring the immediate area of her hiding place, by practicing the meditation techniques he had taught her during their long winter evenings together. But nothing could entirely quiet the fear that gnawed at her heart like a physical pain. It was nearly midnight when she finally heard footsteps in the main cave chamber. Celeste froze, hardly daring to breathe, her hand moving instinctively to the knife Kohana had insisted she carry. The footsteps were careful and deliberate, moving with the kind of stealth that could belong either to Kohana returning safely or to soldiers who had discovered the tunnel and were now hunting her through the underground passages. Celeste, came a low voice from the darkness. It is safe now. You can come out. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she nearly collapsed. She gathered up the supplies and made her way back to the main chamber, where she found Kohana waiting with a grim expression that told her the encounter with the soldiers had not been easy. What happened? She asked as they made their way back through the tunnel toward the shelter. Colonel Hutchinson was very thorough in his questions, Kohana replied, and even in the darkness she could hear the strain in his voice. He suspected that someone had been using the shelter recently, but I convinced him that any signs of habitation were old ones from before I moved to this location. How did you convince him? I showed him other shelters I had built and abandoned, places where the signs of use were obviously months old. I told him I moved frequently to avoid detection by military patrols, which is true enough. Eventually he decided that searching the entire forest would take more time than he could spare. They emerged from the tunnel into the familiar warmth of their shelter, and Celeste could see that Kohana had indeed erased all evidence of her presence. Her sleeping area had been rearranged to look like storage space, her few personal possessions hidden in places where even a thorough search would not reveal them. But as Kohana moved into the firelight, Celeste gasped in horror. His face was marked with fresh bruises, and there was dried blood on his shirt where someone had struck him hard enough to break the skin. His left hand was swollen and discolored in a way that suggested broken bones. What did they do to you? She demanded, moving immediately to examine his injuries. Hutchinson wanted to be certain I was telling the truth about not harboring fugitives, Kohana said with characteristic understatement. He has particular methods for encouraging honesty. Celeste felt rage building in her chest, a clean, pure anger unlike anything she had experienced before. The idea that this good man had suffered pain because of her situation, that he had endured torture to protect her secret, filled her with a fury that made her hands shake as she began treating his wounds. "This is my fault," she said as she cleaned the cuts on his face with water warmed over the fire. "You should never have had to endure this because of me. I chose to help you," Kohana replied firmly. "And I would make the same choice again, knowing the cost. Some things are worth suffering for." As she worked to splint his broken fingers and bandage his wounds, Celeste found herself thinking about the kind of man who would voluntarily endure torture to protect someone he had known for less than a month. In her previous life, she had been surrounded by men who claimed to care for her, but who had proven unwilling to sacrifice even minor conveniences for her well-being. Yet here was someone who had risked his life for her without hesitation or expectation of reward. "Hutchinson will be back," she said as she finished wrapping his injured hand. "He's not the kind of man who gives up easily, especially when his pride has been wounded by someone escaping his justice. Perhaps. But he also cannot spend forever searching empty forests. He has duties at Fort Laramie, superiors who expect results more concrete than chasing rumors through the wilderness. You don't know him like I do. This has become personal for him, not just about catching a fugitive, but about proving he cannot be defied by anyone, especially a woman." Kohana was quiet for several minutes, staring into the fire with the thoughtful expression she had learned to recognize. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested he had been considering this possibility for some time. "Then perhaps it is time to change the nature of the game entirely." "What do you mean?" "I mean that running and hiding will only work for so long. Eventually, men like Hutchinson always find what they are looking for, if only through persistence and superior resources." Celeste felt a chill of foreboding. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that instead of waiting for him to find us, we find him first. On ground of our choosing, under circumstances that favor us rather than him." The idea was both terrifying and oddly appealing. Celeste had spent so many months as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, running from forces that seemed infinitely more powerful than herself. The prospect of taking active steps to resolve her situation, even dangerous ones, held an attraction. That surprised her. "What did you have in mind?" Kohana's rare smile appeared, but this time it carried an edge that reminded her he was, after all, a warrior who had survived the destruction of his entire world. "I have an idea," he said quietly. "But first we need to know more about Hutchinson's plans and resources. And for that, we will need to get close enough to his camp to observe without being seen." "That sounds impossibly dangerous. Most worthwhile things are impossibly dangerous. The question is whether the risk is worth the potential reward." Celeste looked around their warm, comfortable shelter, thinking about the peaceful winter they had been building together, the skills she had been learning, the unexpected happiness she had found in this hidden place between worlds. All of that would have to be abandoned if they chose the path Kohana was suggesting. But she also thought about the bruises on his face, the broken bones in his hand, the fact that good people like him continued to suffer because men like Hutchinson believed their power gave them the right to destroy anyone who inconvenienced them. Perhaps it was time to teach such men that some people, when pushed far enough, pushed back. "Tell me your plan," she said. The old mining camp at Devil's Canyon had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since the silver vein played out, and the miners moved on to more promising prospects in the Black Hills. What remained was a collection of ramshackle buildings slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness-rotting cabins with sagging roofs, a collapsed mill wheel beside a frozen stream, and the dark mouth of a mine shaft that descended into the earth like a wound that refused to heal. It was here, in this ghost town that existed on no official maps, that Kohana and Celeste had spent 2 weeks preparing their elaborate trap for Colonel Bradford Hutchinson. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. Using carefully planted rumors in the frontier towns of Cedar Ridge and Millerville, They had created the fiction that a mysterious woman matching Celeste's description had been seen trading gold nuggets for supplies, claiming to have discovered a rich strike in the abandoned Devil's Canyon mine. The story was designed to appeal to Hutchinson's greed as much as his desire for revenge. The promise of capturing both his fugitive and a fortune in precious metal would be irresistible to a man who had already compromised his military honor. For personal gain, Celeste crouched behind the ruins of the old assay office, her breath forming white clouds in the bitter March air as she watched the eastern approach to the canyon. She wore buckskins now instead of her tattered dress, garments that Kohana had crafted specifically for this mission. The leather was soft and silent, dyed dark brown to blend with the shadows, and reinforced at stress points with strips of sinew that would not tear under strain. Around her waist hung a belt laden with tools of deception smoke bombs made from pine pitch and sulfur, lengths of rope treated with pine sap to prevent freezing, and the small but deadly knife that had become as familiar to her as a sewing needle had once been. The transformation from helpless refugee to competent operative had taken place gradually over the winter months, but it was only now, crouched in the ruins with her heart hammering against her ribs, that Celeste fully understood how completely her life had changed. The woman who had collapsed on the frozen river 3 months ago would never have imagined herself capable of planning an elaborate military ambush, much less executing one with the cold precision of a professional soldier. A soft bird call from across the canyon told her that Kohana was in position near the mine entrance, where the most dangerous part of their plan would unfold. They had spent days preparing the abandoned shaft, rigging it with carefully placed charges of black powder stolen from a railroad construction camp, arranging support timbers that would collapse at precisely the right moment, creating what appeared to be a working mine but was actually an elaborate death trap for anyone greedy enough to venture inside. The sound of approaching horses carried clearly in the thin mountain air, and Celeste felt her muscles tense as she counted the riders. 8 men in military uniforms, led by a figure she recognized even at this distance by his erect posture and the silver eagles gleaming on his shoulders. Colonel Bradford Hutchinson had taken the bait, bringing enough men to handle serious resistance, but not so many as to suggest he expected a major battle. Through her field glasses, a gift from Kohana, who had taken them from a dead cavalry officer years before Celeste studied the faces of Hutchinson's companions. Most were ordinary soldiers, young men following orders without understanding the personal vendetta that drove their commander. But riding beside Hutchinson was a figure that made her blood run cold with recognition. Captain Marcus Thorne, Hutchinson's aide-de-camp and the man who had supervised her interrogation at Fort Laramie, where Hutchinson was driven by wounded pride and thwarted desire. Thorne was motivated by pure sadism, the kind of man who found genuine pleasure in inflicting pain on those unable to defend themselves. During her brief imprisonment, he had made it clear that he looked forward to her execution not for reasons of justice, but for the entertainment value of watching a defiant woman finally broken by military discipline. The soldiers dismounted at the canyon's entrance, taking time to examine the site with professional caution. Hutchinson pointed toward various features of the abandoned camp while Thorne consulted what appeared to be a hand-drawn map, probably one of the forged documents they had arranged to have discovered by friendly contacts in the frontier settlements. Everything was proceeding exactly as they had planned, but Celeste found herself fighting waves of doubt about the wisdom of their strategy. Their plan depended on splitting Hutchinson's force, luring the colonel and his most trusted men into the mine while leaving the ordinary soldiers outside, where they could be dealt with separately. But military men were trained to be suspicious of obvious traps, and Hutchinson had not survived years of frontier warfare by being careless about potential ambushes. If he smelled deception at any point, their carefully laid plans would collapse into chaos that could easily result in both their deaths. Another bird call, this one with a slightly different cadence, told her that Kohana had spotted additional movement in the forest surrounding the camp. Celeste shifted her position slightly and saw what had concerned him. 3 more riders approaching from the south, their uniforms marking them as scouts rather than regular cavalry. Hutchinson had been more cautious than they had anticipated, sending advance men to secure the area before committing himself to the mine investigation. The presence of scouts complicated their plans significantly, but it was too late to abort the mission now. They had spent weeks creating the fiction of the mysterious woman and her gold strike, burning bridges and exhausting resources that could not be replaced. This was their only chance to end Hutchinson's pursuit permanently, and failure would mean spending the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders for the inevitable moment when his persistence finally paid off. Celeste watched as the scouts began a systematic examination of the abandoned buildings, moving with the professional competence of men who understood that carelessness in hostile territory was usually fatal. One of them was heading directly toward her hiding place, his rifle held ready and his eyes scanning for signs of recent occupation. In less than a minute, he would be close enough to spot her despite the shadows and debris that concealed her position. Moving with the fluid silence that Kohana had taught her during their long winter months together, Celeste slipped deeper into the ruins of the assay office. The building's back wall had partially collapsed, creating a maze of fallen timbers and scattered equipment that provided multiple hiding places for someone small and agile enough to navigate them. She squeezed herself into a space between 2 overturned ore carts, drawing her knife and preparing for the possibility that stealth might not be enough. The scout entered the building through what had once been its front door, his boots crunching on broken glass and scattered papers. He moved methodically, checking each potential hiding place with the thoroughness of someone who had learned not to leave anything to chance. Celeste held her breath and pressed herself deeper into the shadows, knowing that discovery would not only mean her death, but would also doom Kohana, who was counting on her to eliminate the scouts before they could warn Hutchinson of the ambush. The soldier was less than 10 feet away when his attention was caught by something outside the building. A shout from one of his companions, followed by the sound of running feet, drew him back toward the canyon's entrance. Through the cracks in the wall, Celeste could see that one of the other scouts had found evidence of recent activity, probably the deliberately placed traces they had left to support the fiction of an active mining operation. She waited until the scout had rejoined his companions before emerging from her hiding place and moving to a position where she could observe the main group. Hutchinson was examining what appeared to be ore samples, his expression showing the kind of intense interest that came from recognizing genuine value. The samples were real enough. Kohana had gathered them from played-out mines throughout the territory, but they had been salted with additional gold dust to create the impression of a much richer strike than had ever existed in Devil's Canyon. The Colonel's greed was clearly warring with his natural military caution, and Celeste could see the moment when avarice won the internal battle. He gestured toward the mine entrance while speaking rapidly to Captain Thorne, his body language conveying excitement and determination. Whatever orders he was giving, they resulted in a division of his force, exactly as she and Kohana had hoped. Hutchinson, Thorne, and 2 of the soldiers began moving toward the mine shaft, while the remaining men established a perimeter around the camp. The 3 scouts were positioned to watch the approaches to the canyon, their attention focused outward rather than on the buildings where danger might already be concealed. It was the distribution of forces they had hoped for, but it also meant that their timing would have to be perfect to prevent any of the survivors from escaping to carry word of the ambush back to Fort Laramie. Celeste began moving through the ruins toward the position where she was supposed to eliminate the scouts. But as she navigated the rubble-strewn terrain, she found herself thinking about the men she was preparing to kill. They were following orders, pursuing what they believed to be a legitimate fugitive, unaware that their commander's motives were personal rather than professional. In her previous life, the idea of taking human life would have been unthinkable. But that woman had died in the Dakota wilderness, along with her illusions about civilized society. The first scout died without ever knowing what killed him. Celeste approached from behind while he was focused on the forest beyond the canyon, her knife sliding between his ribs with the precision Kohana had taught her during their long winter evenings. She lowered his body quietly behind a fallen log, then began moving toward the second man, who was positioned near the abandoned mill wheel. This killing was Messier, the scout turning at the last moment and seeing death approaching in the form of a woman whose face was painted with mud and whose eyes held no mercy. He tried to cry out, but Celeste's hand was already across his mouth, her knife finding the soft spot beneath his jaw with surgical accuracy. Blood soaked into the frozen ground as she dragged his body into the shadows, then began searching for the third scout. She found him exactly where she expected, crouched behind the ruins of a miner's cabin with his rifle trained on the canyon's eastern approach. But as she began her final stalk, Celeste became aware of voices echoing from the mine shaft, angry voices that suggested something had gone wrong with Kohana's part of the plan. The carefully timed detonation that was supposed to collapse the entrance and trap Hutchinson's party inside should have occurred by now. Instead of the muffled roar of controlled explosives, she heard the sharp crack of rifle fire from somewhere deep in the mine, followed by shouts of alarm and what sounded like men scrambling for cover. Something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the third scout was already responding to the commotion. Abandoning his position to investigate the source of the gunfire, Celeste had no choice but to follow, knowing that if Kohana was in trouble, she was his only hope of rescue. She sprinted across the open ground between the ruins and the mine entrance, no longer concerned with stealth now that their carefully orchestrated plan had dissolved into chaos. Behind her, she could hear the remaining soldiers shouting orders and taking positions to repel an attack they didn't understand. The mine shaft descended at a steep angle into darkness that was only partially relieved by oil lamps placed at irregular intervals along the tunnel walls. The sounds of combat were coming from deeper in the mine, where Kohana had positioned himself to trigger the explosive charges at precisely the right moment. But instead of the silence that should have followed a successful cave-in, Celeste could hear ongoing gunfire and the kind of desperate cursing that came from men fighting for their lives in confined spaces. She moved as quickly as she dared down the treacherous slope, her hand trailing along the tunnel wall for guidance while her eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light. The mine had been a dangerous place even when it was operational, with unstable ceilings and hidden shafts that could send the unwary plummeting to their deaths. Now filled with armed men and explosive charges, it had become a deadly maze where a single misstep could trigger disasters far worse than simple cave-ins. The tunnel branched into multiple passages about 50 feet from the entrance, and Celeste had to pause to determine which direction the sounds of battle were coming from. The mine's acoustics made it difficult to pinpoint exact locations, but she could hear Kohana's voice shouting something in Lakota, followed by Hutchinson's reply in English too distorted by echoes to understand clearly. She chose the left-hand passage following the sounds of conflict deeper into the mine's labyrinthine interior. The tunnel here was barely wide enough for two men to walk abreast, with wooden support timbers that creaked ominously under the weight of tons of rock and earth. Some of the oil lamps had been extinguished, either by gunfire or deliberate action, creating pools of absolute darkness that concealed unknown dangers. It was in one of these dark zones that Celeste encountered Captain Thorne, who had apparently become separated from his companions during the initial confusion. He emerged from the shadows like a nightmare-given form, his uniform torn and bloodied, his face twisted with the kind of rage that came from realizing he had been outmaneuvered by people he considered inferior, the famous Celeste Harper. He snarled, raising his service revolver with hands that shook from adrenaline and fury. The woman who thinks she's clever enough to outwit the United States Army. Celeste had no time for the kind of dramatic confrontation that Thorne obviously expected. She threw herself sideways as his gun roared in the confined space, the bullet chipping fragments of rock from the tunnel wall where her head had been. An instant before he could fire again, she was on him with the fury of a wildcat, her knife seeking vital spots while he tried to club her with the heavy revolver. The fight was brief but vicious, two people struggling in near total darkness with weapons that could kill instantly if properly employed. Thorn had advantages of size and strength, but Celeste had been taught by a master of close combat, and she had the desperate motivation of someone fighting not just for her own life, but for the life of the man she had come to love. The captain's death was neither clean nor quick. He died the way he had lived, violently and without honor, his blood mixing with the ancient dust of the mine floor. Celeste stood over his body for a moment, breathing heavily and trying to process the reality of what she had become, a killer. Efficient enough to dispatch trained soldiers in single combat, but there was no time for philosophical reflection. The sounds of battle were moving deeper into the mine, suggesting that Kohana was being driven back by superior numbers. Celeste retrieved Thorn's revolver and ammunition, then continued down the tunnel toward whatever final confrontation awaited. In the depths of Devil's Canyon, she found them in a natural cavern that the miners had expanded into a storage area for equipment and ore samples. Kohana was crouched behind an overturned ore cart, blood streaming from a head wound, but still returning fire at three men who had him pinned down with crossfire from multiple positions. Colonel Hutchinson was among them, his military precision evident in the way he coordinated his men's movements to gradually tighten the noose around their quarry. "Surrender now and you'll hang cleanly," Hutchinson shouted across the cavern. "Keep fighting and I'll make sure you die slowly, the way your savage people deserve." Kohana's response was a rifle shot that came close enough to Hutchinson's head to make the colonel duck back behind his own cover. But Celeste could see that her partner was running low on ammunition, and his defensive position was being steadily eroded by the soldiers' systematic advance. Unless something changed the tactical situation quickly, the next few minutes would see the end of everything they had worked toward. It was then that Celeste remembered the explosive charges that Kohana had placed throughout the mine's support structure. The devices had not been triggered at the proper time, but they were still in position, still connected to the detonation system he had spent weeks installing. If she could reach the main control point, she might be able to bring down enough of the mine to eliminate Hutchinson's men, while creating an escape route for herself and Kohana. The control point was located in a side chamber about 30 feet from the ongoing battle, but reaching it would require crossing open ground under fire from men who would shoot to kill the moment they spotted her. It was a desperate gamble, but no more desperate than their entire situation had become. Sometimes survival required risks that rational people would never take. Celeste took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and sprinted across the cavern floor toward the chamber where salvation or death awaited with equal probability. The detonation control chamber was smaller than Celeste had expected, carved from living rock and reinforced with timber supports that groaned under the weight of the mountain above. Kohana had spent weeks preparing this space, running copper wires through carefully drilled holes to connect with explosive charges, placed at strategic points throughout the mine's structure. The system was elegant in its simplicity, a single lever that would send electrical current racing through the network, triggering simultaneous explosions designed to bring down specific sections of tunnel, while leaving escape routes intact. But as Celeste reached for the detonation lever, she realized that Kohana's meticulous planning had not accounted for one crucial variable: her own position relative to the blast zones. The chamber where she crouched was directly beneath one of the primary charge points, and triggering the explosions would almost certainly result in her own death, along with Hutchinson's men. It was a choice between saving Kohana and sacrificing herself, or allowing the colonel to complete his murderous mission. Behind her, the gunfire in the main cavern was becoming more sporadic, suggesting that Kohana's ammunition was nearly exhausted. She could hear Hutchinson shouting orders to his men, coordinating a final assault that would overwhelm her partner's defensive position. In less than 5 minutes, the battle would be over, and without any chance of preventing Hutchinson from continuing his vendetta against anyone who had dared to defy his authority. Celeste's hand hovered over the detonation lever as she tried to calculate angles and blast radii, searching for some alternative that might allow both of them to survive. But the mathematics were unforgiving. The charges had been positioned to create maximum structural damage, not to protect anyone foolish enough to remain inside the mine when they exploded. Kohana had assumed they would both be safely outside. Before the final phase of their plan was implemented, a new sound echoed through the tunnels from somewhere near the mine entrance, the thunder of hoofbeats and the shouting of many voices approaching at high speed. At first, Celeste thought Hutchinson had brought reinforcements, but the voices were speaking a language she had learned to recognize during her winter with Kohana. Lakota warriors had arrived at Devil's Canyon, and they were coming down into the mine with the fury of men who had found their enemies trapped in a place with no escape. The gunfire from the main cavern suddenly intensified as Hutchinson's remaining soldiers found themselves caught between two hostile forces. But instead of the disciplined volleys of military engagement, the new sounds were the chaotic violence of close-quarters combat war cries and screams, the whistle of arrows, and the wet thud of tomahawks finding their targets. The Lakota had not come to conduct a siege, but to exact vengeance for generations of broken promises and murdered families. Through the maze of tunnels came a voice that Celeste recognized with shock that nearly paralyzed her Kohana's younger brother, Chayton, calling out in their native language with words that sounded like both greeting and battle cry. The family she had believed completely destroyed at Standing Rock had not all perished in that massacre. Some had survived, had been searching for Kohana throughout the long winter, and had finally tracked into this remote canyon through methods that would have baffled white trackers. The dynamics of the battle shifted instantly as Hutchinson realized his force was now outnumbered and surrounded by enemies who showed no inclination toward taking prisoners. The colonel's voice could be heard shouting increasingly desperate orders, trying to rally his men for a fighting retreat that would get them out of the mine before they were all slaughtered in its depths. But the Lakota warriors had positioned themselves to block every exit, turning the underground complex into a tomb for the soldiers who had spent years hunting their people. Celeste abandoned the detonation chamber and began working her way back toward the main cavern, moving carefully through tunnels that had become a battlefield where death could come from any direction without warning. The oil lamps that had provided illumination were being systematically extinguished, either by design or accident, creating a maze of shadows where enemies and allies became indistinguishable until they were close enough to kill. She found Kohana pressed against the wall of a side passage, reloading his rifle with methodical precision despite the chaos surrounding him. Blood continued to seep from the head wound he had sustained earlier, but his hands were steady and his eyes held the fierce concentration of a warrior who had found his element. When he saw her approaching, relief flickered across his features. "I thought you were dead," he said, his voice barely audible above the sounds of combat echoing through the cavern. "I almost was. Thorn is dead and the scouts are eliminated, but your brother and his warriors arrived before I could trigger the charges." Kohana's expression shifted to something between joy and concern. "Chayton is here? How many men did he bring?" "I don't know, but enough to trap Hutchinson's remaining force. The question is whether they'll leave any survivors to carry word back to Fort Laramie." Before Kohana could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead of them, a Lakota warrior wearing war paint and carrying a rifle that gleamed with fresh blood. The man was younger than Kohana, but bore a strong family resemblance, with the same high cheekbones and intelligent eyes. When he saw his brother, his fierce expression softened into something approaching joy. The reunion between the brothers was brief but intensely emotional. conducted in rapid Lakota that Celeste could only partially understand, but she caught enough words to realize that Chayton had brought disturbing news about events at Standing Rock and other reservations throughout the territory. The systematic oppression and murder of Indian families had continued and intensified, making any possibility of peaceful coexistence increasingly remote. "We must leave this place," Chayton said, switching to English for Celeste's benefit. "More soldiers will come when these do not return to their fort. The time for hiding in the wilderness is over. Our people are gathering for a final resistance. And we need every warrior who can still fight." Kohana looked at Celeste with an expression that held both love and terrible sadness. She could see him calculating distances and possibilities, weighing his obligations to his surviving family against his commitment to the woman who had shared his exile through the long winter months. The choice he faced was one that would define the rest of his life, regardless of how long that life might last. "Go with them," Celeste said before he could speak. "Your people need you more than I do. I can find my own way to safety now." "No," Kohana replied with quiet certainty. "I will not abandon you the way I abandoned my family at Standing Rock. We face whatever comes next together, or we do not face it at all." Chayton studied Celeste with the appraising gaze of a man who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. "This is the woman you spoke of in your messages? The one who chose exile rather than submit to false justice?" "She is more than that," Kohana said. "She is my partner in all things, and she has earned the right to be treated as family rather than as an outsider." The formal declaration carried weight in Lakota culture that Celeste was only beginning to understand. But before she could respond, the sound of renewed gunfire from the main cavern reminded them all that their personal concerns were secondary to the immediate necessity of survival. They made their way through the tunnels toward the sounds of battle, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who had learned to trust each other completely. The main cavern had become a slaughterhouse, with bodies of both soldiers and warriors scattered among the mining equipment. But the tide of combat had clearly turned in favor of the Lakota, who had superior numbers and the advantage of fighting. On ground of their choosing, Colonel Hutchinson was making his final stand near the cavern's far wall, his uniform torn and bloodied, his service revolver clicking empty as he tried to reload with hands that shook from wounds and exhaustion. Only 2 of his soldiers remained alive, and they were clearly more interested in surrender than in continued resistance. But the Lakota warriors surrounding them showed no inclination toward accepting surrender from men who had spent years murdering their families. "Wait," Kohana called out in Lakota, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This one is mine to kill." The warriors paused in their advance, creating a circle around Hutchinson that isolated him from any hope of rescue or escape. The colonel looked up at Kohana with the expression of a man who had finally understood that his luck had run out, but who was determined to face death with whatever dignity remained to him. "I should have killed you when I had the chance," Hutchinson said, his voice carrying the bitterness of a man whose pride had led him to catastrophic defeat. "Yes," Kohana agreed simply. "You should have. But your arrogance made you believe that one Indian was not worth your personal attention." Hutchinson raised his empty revolver, perhaps hoping to provoke Kohana into a quick death rather than the slow torture that captured soldiers could expect from Plains warriors. But Kohana made no move to end the confrontation quickly. Instead, he began speaking in English, his words carrying across the cavern with the weight of formal judgment. "You came to this place hunting an innocent woman whose only crime was refusing your advances. You brought soldiers to die for your wounded pride. You tortured prisoners and broke treaties, believing your uniform gave you the right to destroy anyone who inconvenienced you. I was doing my duty as an officer of the United States Army." Hutchinson replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your duty was to protect the innocent and serve justice. Instead, you served only your own desires for power and revenge. Kohana's rifle remained lowered, but his presence dominated the cavern like a force of nature. Now you will face the justice you denied to others. What followed was not the quick death that Hutchinson might have hoped for, but it was more merciful than what he had earned through his years of cruelty. Kohana's justice was swift and final, delivered with the precision of a man who understood the difference between necessary killing and sadistic torture. When it was over, the last obstacle to Celeste's freedom had been permanently removed, but freedom, she was learning, was more complicated than simply eliminating enemies. As the Lakota warriors began the grim task of disposing of bodies and erasing evidence of the battle, Celeste found herself faced with choices that would determine not just where she would live, but who she would become in whatever life remained. To her, Chayton approached her as she stood beside Kohana, studying her with the same penetrating gaze that had first assessed her character. My brother says you have learned our ways during the winter months, that you can hunt and fight, prepare hides, and preserve meat. I learned what Kohana taught me, Celeste replied carefully, uncertain where this conversation was leading. Good. Because where we are going, such skills will mean the difference between survival and death. The old world is ending, and what comes next will require people who can adapt to circumstances that no one has faced before, Kohana explained, as they gathered their few possessions and prepared to leave Devil's Canyon forever. The scattered bands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and other Plains tribes were converging on a remote valley in the Bighorn Mountains, where traditional leaders were attempting to forge a confederation strong enough to resist the final push of American expansion. It was probably a doomed effort, but it represented the last chance for his people to die as free warriors, rather than live as defeated prisoners on government reservations. And you want to join this confederation, Celeste said, understanding the implications. I want to spend whatever time remains to me fighting beside my people rather than hiding in the wilderness like a coward, Kohana replied. But I will not ask you to share that fate. You have already sacrificed more than anyone should have to for my sake. Celeste looked around the cavern where she had killed armed men in single combat, where she had been prepared to sacrifice her own life to save the man she loved. The woman who had collapsed on the frozen river 4 months ago would never have imagined herself capable of such violence, such dedication, such fierce loyalty to someone from a completely different world. Where you go, I go, she said finally. We face whatever comes together, remember? The smile that crossed Kohana's face was worth more than all the comfortable certainty she had abandoned when she chose love over safety. Together, they followed Chayton and his warriors out of the mine and into the uncertain future that awaited in the mountains, where the last free Indians of the Great Plains were gathering for their final stand against the tide of history. Behind them, Devil's Canyon returned to the silence that had claimed it when the silver played out and the miners moved on. But now it held secrets that would never be discovered, the bodies of soldiers who had died pursuing personal vendettas, the evidence of a love that had transcended cultural boundaries, and the proof that sometimes, when pushed far enough, even the gentlest souls could become instruments of terrible justice. The sun was setting as they emerged from the mine, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Celeste of the first dawn she had seen from Kohana's hidden shelter. But this was not an ending, it was a transformation, a passage from one life to another that would test everything she had learned about courage, loyalty, and the price of choosing love over security. 2 years later, in a hidden valley that existed on no government maps, Celeste Harper, who was now called Morning Star, knelt beside a crystal-clear stream, teaching her adopted daughter Little Fox how to weave grass into watertight baskets. The water ran pure over stones worn smooth by centuries of mountain snowmelt, and the technique she demonstrated connected them to an unbroken chain of women stretching back to the dawn of human memory. The valley of Shappa, the place where sacred winds dance, had become home to nearly 300 survivors from a dozen different tribes, all united by their refusal to accept reservation life and their determination to preserve the old ways in a world bent on destroying every trace of indigenous culture. It was not the dramatic last stand that warriors sang about, but something quieter and perhaps more important, a living preservation of traditions that would otherwise have been lost forever. Celeste had arrived as a white woman fleeing false accusations, but over 2 winters and summers she had been transformed into something new, neither fully white nor fully Lakota, but rather a bridge between worlds that had been at war for generations. Her pale skin marked her as an outsider, but her skills with bow and knife, her knowledge of traditional medicines, and most importantly her absolute loyalty to Kohana and his people had earned her acceptance as true family. Little Fox was not her biological daughter, but an orphan from the Pine Ridge Massacre who had been placed in her care. The girl was perhaps 8 years old, with quick intelligence and cautious wariness that came from having seen too much violence. Too young. But under Celeste's patient guidance, she was learning to laugh again, to believe that there might be a future worth living. "Morning Star," came a voice behind them. Celeste turned to see Winona, the medicine woman who had become her closest friend among the tribal elders, approaching with measured steps. Winona was ancient at nearly 70 years, but still possessed sharp intelligence and deep spiritual wisdom that made her one of the community's most respected leaders. "The council wishes to speak with you," Winona said, settling beside them on the grassy bank. "There are decisions to be made about the future, and your voice is needed." Celeste felt the familiar mixture of honor and trepidation that came with being included in tribal decision-making. As an adopted member, she had been granted the right to participate in councils, but remained aware that her perspective differed significantly from those born into this culture. "What kinds of decisions?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. For months, there had been growing debates about whether their hidden valley could remain concealed indefinitely. Scouts report increased military activity in surrounding territories, Winona confirmed her fears. New forts being built, new roads carved through sacred lands. "The soldiers aren't looking for us specifically, but their presence makes it increasingly difficult for our hunting parties to gather supplies without detection." They made their way through the valley toward the council lodge, passing scenes that had become as familiar to Celeste as her childhood memories of Boston. Women tanned hides and prepared pemmican, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. Children played games that taught hunting skills and tribal history simultaneously, their laughter echoing off valley walls like nature's own music. The council lodge stood at the valley's heart, built according to traditional specifications, but incorporating innovations developed through centuries of adaptation. Inside, the community's senior members sat in a circle around a central fire, their faces painted with gravity appropriate to discussions that might determine whether their way of life would survive another generation. Kohana was among them, his position reflecting the respect he had earned through his knowledge of both traditional culture and modern realities. Celeste took her place in the circle, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with helping make decisions affecting people who had already sacrificed everything for the privilege of living according to their own values. Chief Spotted Eagle, the oldest member and closest thing to a traditional leader, spoke first in formal cadences reserved for occasions of great importance. "We have lived in this place for 2 winters without discovery, preserving traditions that might otherwise have been lost forever. Our children have learned the old stories, the old ways, but we cannot remain hidden forever." The chief paused before continuing with the more difficult aspects of their situation. "Already our hunting territories overlap with areas being explored by white settlers and government surveyors. Soon we will face the choice that has confronted our people: repeatedly submit to reservation life, or fight a war we cannot win." Chayton, Kohana's brother, spoke next with passionate intensity. "I say we fight. Better to die as free warriors than live as prisoners begging for scraps from our enemies' tables. If this is to be the end of our people's independence, Let it be an ending worthy of songs. His words stirred murmurs of agreement. From younger men, but concerned looks from elders who had seen too many glorious last stands that accomplished nothing except adding to unnecessary deaths. The tension between honor and practicality had been tearing at the community's heart for months. Winona raised her hand for permission to speak, and the lodge fell silent. I have buried 3 husbands, 7 children, and more grandchildren than I care to count. All died believing they were protecting our way of life from destruction. But death cannot preserve anything, only life can do that. It was Kohana who finally voiced the alternative everyone had been considering, but no one wanted to speak aloud. There are places where the government's reach is still limited. Oregon Territory, Northern California, parts of Canada where officials are more concerned with gold rushes than hunting down small groups of Indians who cause no trouble. You speak of running away, Chayton said, disappointment clear in his voice. I speak of strategic retreat, Kohana replied calmly. Of preserving what can be preserved, rather than losing everything in a gesture that will be forgotten within a generation. The debate continued for hours, but it was when Celeste was finally invited to speak that the discussion took an unexpected turn. She had been weighing all arguments against her unique perspective as someone who had lived in both worlds. I came to this valley as a fugitive from white man's justice, she began, her voice carrying clearly. I was running from men who wanted to destroy me, because I refused to accept their version of what my life should be. In that way, my situation was not so different from yours. She paused, choosing words carefully. But I have learned something that might offer a different path forward. The government's power comes not just from superior weapons, but from its ability to control information, to tell the story of what happens between whites and Indians in ways that justify whatever actions it wants to take. The council members leaned forward, intrigued. What if we could tell our own story? What if instead of hiding or fighting or running, we found ways to show the outside world what we have built here? The beauty of your traditions, the wisdom of your relationship with the natural world, the proof that different peoples can live together in peace. Chief Spotted Eagle frowned thoughtfully. How would such a thing be possible? Who in the white world would listen to Indian voices? There are people, Celeste said. Newspaper editors in eastern cities questioning the official version of Western expansion. Writers and artists fascinated by cultures they see as more authentic than industrial society. Even some government officials starting to understand that current policies are not only morally wrong, but practically unsustainable. She looked around the circle, seeing skepticism but growing interest. I still have contacts in the civilized world, people who knew me before I became Morning Star. If we could arrange for carefully selected visitors to see what you have accomplished here, to witness the reality of your community rather than myths and stereotypes, Winona nodded. Slowly. Stories have power, sometimes more power than weapons. If we could change the stories that white people tell about us, we might change the policies that grow from those stories. Over the following weeks, plans took shape for what they called the Bridge Building Project, a careful campaign to introduce selected members of white society to their valley community. Celeste would serve as primary liaison, using her knowledge of both worlds to identify potential allies and arrange meetings that might gradually shift public opinion. The first visitors arrived in early autumn: a sympathetic journalist from the Chicago Tribune, a Quaker missionary couple disillusioned with government Indian policies, and a photographer specializing in documenting vanishing ways of life. What they saw challenged every assumption about savage Indians living in primitive squalor. Instead, they encountered a functioning society that had successfully combined the best aspects of traditional culture with practical innovations necessary for survival. Children who could read and write in 3 languages. Adults who had mastered both ancient crafts and modern skills. A community that had achieved harmony between human needs and environmental stewardship. The articles and photographs that, resulted began appearing in Eastern publications, presenting a view of Indian life that contradicted the official narrative of inevitable conflict. Public opinion, particularly among educated urban populations, began shifting toward policies that would allow communities like the Valley to exist legally rather than as fugitives. 3 years after the first tentative contacts, the Valley received official recognition as the Shappa Cultural Preserve, a unique legal entity that allowed residents to maintain traditional ways while serving as a living educational resource. It was not everything they had hoped for, but something no one had thought possible. Celeste stood again beside the clear stream, but now she watched little Fox, 11 years old and fluent in 4 languages, teach basket weaving to visitors from a women's college in Massachusetts. The girl had grown into a confident young person who moved easily between worlds, serving as a bridge between cultures in ways her teachers had never imagined. Kohana approached from behind, his footsteps silent as they had been that morning, when he found her collapsed on the frozen river. But now his approach brought not rescue from despair, but the simple pleasure of sharing another peaceful moment in a life they had built together against all odds. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, settling beside her. "Giving up the world you were born into for this one?" Celeste considered the question seriously. "I regret the circumstances that forced me to leave. I regret the violence and injustice that made escape necessary. But I have never regretted finding you, or choosing to build this life with you and your people." She looked around the valley that had become more truly home than any place she had ever lived. "Sometimes I think that woman who collapsed on the frozen river had to die so that Morning Star could be born. And Morning Star has lived a life worth all the pain that preceded it." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded her of that first dawn in Kohana's winter shelter, Celeste reflected on the strange paths that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as a refugee from injustice and become an agent of reconciliation between worlds that had seemed destined for eternal conflict. The frozen river where their story began was hundreds of miles away, but its lesson remained always that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources, that healing could emerge from the deepest wounds, and that love could triumph over forces that sought to divide people from hope. In the gathering darkness, the lights of their community began to twinkle like stars across the valley floor, each representing a life preserved, a tradition maintained, a story that would continue unfolding. It was not the ending anyone had expected when a desperate woman collapsed beside a frozen river and a compassionate man chose to wrap her in his blanket rather than leave her to die alone. But it was an ending worthy of the love that had made it possible, and a beginning that promised even greater wonders for the generations that would follow across the bridge they had built between 2 worlds.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.